What's up? Nothing. Let's start the review. Okay. So, despite being a pretty big reader, I haven't read a lot of Neil Gaiman. I know, it's a shortcoming to be sure, but I'm trying to rectify that, and so I read one of his most well-known children's stories, Coraline. The story of a little girl with an unusual name who crosses over into a seemingly perfect world where everybody understands her. In 2009, Henry Sellick directed a stop-motion animation adaptation of the same name, starring the vocal talent of Dakota Fanning and Terry Hatcher. It was well received and considered by many fans to be just as creepy as the book, maybe even creepier. But how does the stop-motion animation stack up against Neil Gaiman's story? Let's find out. This is Books vs. Movies review of Coraline. We'll start, of course, with our main heroine and title character, Coraline. Coraline Jones has been compared to Alice from Alice in Wonderland, and it's a pretty fitting comparison. She basically serves the same purpose as any other generic protagonist from a story about a fantasy world. Coraline is an everyday girl who children can relate with, especially older children, because nobody seems to understand or acknowledge Coraline. They can't even get her name right. But unlike Alice and Dorothy, who basically just take us on these fun adventures through these magical lands, Coraline is also the heroine and defeats the bad guy and saves the world from her antics. And to be perfectly honest, in the book, this character bored me. I understand that she's supposed to be the generic kid, but she can still have some personality. I think my main problem with this character is that her emotions were always downplayed. She was a little annoyed, or a little enchanted, or a little frightened, or a little relieved. I just never felt like she was engaged with the story, and because of that, I was never engaged with the story. The movie Coraline showed emotion. She actually shows her annoyance, her enchantment, her fear, her relief, and because of that, we feel annoyance, enchantment, fear, and relief in the way that we really don't in the book. But because of this, book Coraline does seem to grow a little bit more. She starts off as the kind of easily bored, though imaginative little girl, and ends up more mature and grown up, and not taking the love of her parents for granted. We'll talk about the role that the antagonist plays in this a little bit later in the review, but in general, Coraline realizes that life in the real world isn't so bad, at least not compared to the price she'd have to pay to live in the other world, losing her identity. But movie Coraline is actually tempted by the other world. She wants to go there, she wants to stay there, and it's only after she realizes the price and the diabolical nature of the villain that she changes her mind. I really don't get that with book Coraline. She always seemed more weirded out by the other world, as if she was always just a little bit suspicious. Because of this, she doesn't really grow as dramatically as my literary counterpart would have us believe. Because she's actually tempted to leave the real world behind in the movie, it makes the messages of identity and not taking the ones who love you for granted that much stronger. Plus, she's just a more dynamic and interesting character, so in reality there's no real contest here. Movie Coraline wins. But what about our antagonist? Not just the other mother, but the fake, too-good-to-be-true world that she created to entice Coraline. This is a pretty creepy bad guy, partly because when she first shows up, there's no indication that she is the bad guy. And not because she acts sweet and solicitous, but also because she doesn't really stand out from the other characters. They all want to please Coraline and to make her happy. Of course, as it turns out, they're all working for the other mother. Her motivations aren't really clear in either version of the story, but in general it seems like she wants someone to love, or at the very least, someone to keep. In the book, she captures somebody, she loves them for a while, and then she grows tired of them and throws them away. The movie drives this point home by making the mother into a giant spider-like creature, and as the world begins to disintegrate, it actually disintegrates into what appears to be a giant spider web. At first, the mother seems pretty much like the real mother, and the world seems pretty much like the real world, only better. But as the movie progresses and Coraline resists more and more, we start to see this other world for what it really is. The movie draws a nice contrast between this world and the real world, making the other world seem tempting at first and progressively more and more creepy as we get towards the end. But the book really plays up this other world as kind of a game, with everything laid out before her, but in kind of an arbitrary way. For example, in the book, the other mother offers no hints as to where the other children and her parents are, whereas in the movie she actually makes it incredibly easy for her to find them. Though, since the other mother never plans on letting her go anyway, it's kind of a moot point, I suppose. Still though, the book mother does seem to be a little bit cleverer in that way. Also, you really get the feeling that the book antagonist is this ancient foe who has done this several times before. She even has a threatening sounding name, as though she's this ancient and well-established mythical beast. But with the movie Mother, you really get the feeling that she has a plan. You see this especially with the dolls that she makes and sends out to the children that she wishes to lure into her web. And the other world just seems better thought out in this version. The mythology of the book was never really made clear and was actually a little confusing. And while this might make the villain more predictable, that is kind of the point of the battle of the other world, and it draws a nice contrast between the real world battle where she has to defeat the villain again. The antagonist of the movie was just, in general, more clear. But what about the Now let's look at the other characters in Coraline's life. Seeing as how we've already looked at the characters from the other world, and seeing as how they're not really real anyway, we're just going to look at the other characters in the real world in this category. And I'm sorry, the characters from the movie are just annoying! They are so irritating. I can understand why Coraline wanted to stay in the other world. But in the movie's defense, the book's characters are kind of annoying too. I mean, that is kind of the point of the other characters. They don't fully understand Coraline because they're so wrapped up in their own little worlds, and Coraline has to learn to accept that and live with it, that the world isn't perfect, nor should it be. So it makes sense that we would find the people in Coraline's life a little grating, and if anything, that makes the other world that much more tempting. Still, while they do need to be a little annoying, they also need to be likable enough for Coraline to realize that she shouldn't take them for granted. I never got that in the movie. The book characters have that balance of annoying and likable, whereas the movie characters are just annoying. Not only that, but the mother in the real world is just plain mean. I mean, she's a bitch! She's awful! I understand that she's in a bad place financially and she needs to work and she's probably really tired and stressed out, but I never got any indication that she actually loved her daughter. I mean, why doesn't she just explain to Coraline the situation that she's in? She seems like a pretty smart girl. I think she'd be able to handle it. But the way she acts most of the time, you'd think she was the wicked stepmother in a fairy tale. Now, I'll admit that I haven't said a whole lot good about the characters in the book, and they don't really stand out very much, and I'll admit that the annoyingness of the characters in the movie draws a nice contrast between them and the characters in the real world, but I don't care. Book wins. But now we've got the descriptive style of Neil Gaiman versus the animation style of Henry Sellick. Sellick, of course, has a unique style of stop-motion animation that can be found in such movies as The Nightmare Before Christmas or James and the Giant Peach. And I have to admit, it's really kind of nice to see stop-motion animation that doesn't look like Rankin Bass. The images are very creative, they add a lot to the creepy atmosphere of the story, and I love the design of a lot of the characters, especially the other mother as the spider-like creature. This is a good-looking movie. But I have to be honest, I'm not really crazy about his style of animation. I mean, it worked in Nightmare Before Christmas, but it just doesn't seem to work in his other movies. It's kind of like Tim Burton's direction in a way. It doesn't matter what the subject matter is, it looks creepy. And yeah, this is a creepy story, but not every aspect of the story needs to be that way. It's also a lot like Tim Burton in that it's nice and creative and cool to look at, but after a while it becomes really distracting. It's just my opinion, I know, but I really don't think that's what this story needs. It works okay for the stuff in the other world because the stuff in the other world is supposed to look kind of creepy, but the stuff in the real world just looks off. And you could argue that it looks very caricature-like, but again, that makes sense for the other world, but I don't see any reason for it in the real world. It's like the movie just isn't taking itself seriously. Plus, it's going up against the descriptive style of Neil Gaiman, and that's a really tough act to follow. Gaiman is one of those authors who really knows how to manipulate the English language to invoke really vivid imagery. Even though I wasn't altogether crazy about the story itself, the book was enjoyable to read because of the descriptions and the style of the writing. Maybe I'm biased here, but then again, I'm always biased. And I really do think that Gaiman's descriptive writing style is better than the weirdness of Sellick's animation. And now, on to story. Unfortunately, I wasn't favorably impressed with either version of this story. Both book and movie move really slowly in the beginning, which I guess was part of the point because Coraline's life is so boring, but it doesn't have to be quite so boring. The book does have a really good contrast between fantasy and reality in the way that Coraline has to defeat the other mother. In the book, she basically has to defeat her twice. In the other world, it's set up very much like a video game with everything laid out before her, but in the real world, it's not so simple. Coraline has to actually think for herself and use whatever resources she can find, and they aren't just arbitrarily laid out for her. The movie doesn't quite get this point across. Coraline moves so quickly from the other world to the real world that there just isn't time to make that point very effectively. Also, as I mentioned before, you really do feel the ancientness of the book's mythology. Like, this foe in this world have been around for centuries, but we don't truly understand them, whereas in the movie, they're just kind of there. However, so many things in this mythology are muddled and confused. For example, why is the wall sometimes bricked up, and why is it sometimes not? In the movie, Coraline first encounters the other world in a dream, and as she delves more deeply into that dream, the world opens itself more to her. Plus, the antagonist actually seeks Coraline out rather than Coraline finding her by accident. And she actually sends out the doll to spy on her. There is a method of capture which helps to bring home the spider analogy. And I do like that the game that Coraline plays against the other mother actually has a little bit more to it than just look through the hole in the stone and find the glowy things. She actually goes to specific places based on the hint from the other mother, and so it's more of a thinking game than it is a searching game. And in the end, the movie is just more creepy. I never really found the book that creepy, but the movie really is, partly because of the spidery antagonist, and partly because of the way that they expand the doll analogy. The book might have better imagery, or at least imagery that I like more, but the movie really creates that creepy atmosphere. Now, that isn't to say that I wasn't a little confused watching the movie too, but the mythology and the story in the movie are at least a little bit more clear, and so in the end, I was more satisfied watching the movie than I was reading the book. Well, thanks for joining us for another...
Hello, Hatter. We've been expecting you.